My world, for the longest time, was the size of a two-story house with a squeaky porch swing and a garden full of my mother's stubborn roses. It was a world defined by the scent of old books, lemon tea, and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of my father in the room next to mine. For 15 years, since my mother passed, my life had been a singular devotion to him. I was his hands when arthritis made his own useless, his eyes when the words on a page began to blur, his memory when the tendrils of time began to steal his own. I didn't see it as a sacrifice. How could it be a sacrifice to care for the sun around which your entire universe revolved? My friends from college went on to build careers, families, lives that expanded. Mine contracted, focusing into a single, intense point of light. Him. My mornings began with a soft clink of his teacup against its saucer, a ritual as sacred as any prayer. I'd help him dress, read him the newspaper, and listen to the same stories of his youth, each time finding a new detail to cherish, a new inflection in his voice to memorize. The afternoons were for quiet companionship, the television murmuring in the background as I managed the household finances, the grocery lists, the endless appointments. My love for him was the very architecture of my existence. I had built my entire life within the walls of that house, a fortress of love and duty, and I believed it was impenetrable. I believed my place in it, my value, was as solid and real as the foundation beneath my feet. I was wrong. The day we buried him was gray and damp, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. The church was filled with faces I barely recognized, distant relatives, old business associates of my father's, people who sent a card at Christmas but hadn't seen him in a decade. I sat in the front pew, a hollowed-out shell of a person, feeling their pitying glances like physical blows. My cousin, Mark, sat beside me. He was my father's only nephew, a man who always smelled of expensive cologne and impatience. He'd visited twice a year, his stays brief and transactional, his eyes always scanning the house, cataloging the antiques, the silver, the assets. During the service, he placed a hand on my arm, a gesture that was meant to look comforting to the assembled crowd but felt to me like the grip of a predator. After the final prayer, as people began to file out, offering their mumbled condolences, Mark steered me towards the church vestry, where a small group of close family had gathered. His wife, a woman with a face as sharp and unforgiving as broken glass, was there, along with my aunt and uncle. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with grief. Mark cleared his throat, a sound that was too loud, too performative. Before we proceed to the wake, he began, his voice taking on a tone of magnanimous authority, there are a few matters to clarify. As the executor of my uncle's estate, he paused, looking directly at me. The look in his eyes wasn't one of sympathy. It was triumph. We all appreciate the care you provided for him in his final years, Clara. It was convenient. The word hung in the air, ugly and dismissive. However, he continued, picking a piece of lint from his perfectly tailored suit, we need to be clear about your position now. My uncle, in his wisdom, left everything to his blood relatives, to his family. My aunt shifted her feet, her gaze fixed on the stained glass window. No one would look at me. A cold dread, sharp and metallic, began to creep up my spine. I don't understand, Mark, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I am his family. He let out a short, pitying laugh. It was the cruelest sound I had ever heard. Oh, Clara. My dear, sweet, naive Clara. You're not his daughter. You're not his blood. Everyone here knows it. Your mother brought you into the marriage. He was your stepfather. A generous one, to be sure. He gave you a home, he fed you, he clothed you. But he wasn't your father, and you are not his family. You have no claim here. The words struck me with the force of a physical assault. My breath hitched in my chest. I looked around the room, searching for a lifeline, for someone to deny it, to say he was lying. But I found only averted eyes and stony silence. They all knew. They had always known, and had let me live in the warmth of a lie. The man I had dedicated my life to, the man whose hand I held as he took his last breath, was not my father. And in the eyes of these people, that biological fact erased 15 years of love, of care, of devotion. It meant nothing. I meant nothing. My entire identity, the bedrock of my world, crumbled into dust in that cold, silent room. I was an outsider, a stranger, a convenience. At that moment, my floor disappeared. It was the deepest pain I have ever felt. If you have ever been through a great disappointment and understand what it is to have your heart broken, please like this video so I know I'm not alone on this journey. The days that followed are a blur of muted gray. Mark had given me a week to vacate the house. A week to pack up a life that was no longer mine. I moved in a daze, wrapping my mother's china in newspaper, folding clothes that suddenly felt like they belonged to a stranger. Every object I touched was a ghost, a memory of a life I'd been tricked into believing was real. I left with 2 suitcases and a small box of photographs, the only things they hadn't considered part of the estate. My new home was a tiny, third-floor walk-up in a part of town I barely knew existed. The paint was peeling, the single window looked out onto a brick wall, and the pipes groaned like a dying animal every time I turned on the water. The silence was the worst part. After years of being attuned to the sounds of another person, the soft cough, the shuffle of slippers, the murmur of a television, the oppressive quiet of that room was a constant, screaming reminder of my solitude. I was adrift. The small savings I had dwindled quickly. I took a job washing dishes in a greasy diner, my hands, which had once so gently tended to my father, now perpetually raw and smelling of bleach. I'd come home late at night, my body aching, and eat a can of cold soup over the sink, too exhausted to even sit at the tiny, wobbly table. The darkness was an entity, a living thing that sat with me in that room. It whispered that Mark was right. I was nothing, a footnote in someone else's story. My life had been a lie, and now it was over. I had no skills, no purpose, no family. I was just Clara. And Clara was no one. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to even exist. I felt myself fading, becoming as gray and anonymous as the brick wall outside my window. It was during one of those bleak, endless nights, about 2 months after the funeral, that my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but some flicker of instinct made me answer. "Miss Clara?" a hesitant, familiar voice asked. It was Father Michael, the priest from the funeral. He sounded nervous. He asked if he could visit, saying it was a matter of some importance. The next afternoon, he stood awkwardly in my small apartment, clutching an old shoebox. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He told me how much he had admired my devotion to the man I knew as my father. He told me how what my cousin had done in the vestry had sickened him. "Your place in that family was earned through love, Clara, not dictated by blood," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And he knew that. He knew what they were like. He then pushed the shoebox into my hands. He came to see me about a month before he passed. He was worried. He knew he didn't have much time, and he knew Mark would try to twist things. He asked me to hold on to this for you. He made me promise to give it to you personally if things went badly. My hands trembled as I opened the box. Inside, nestled among some old letters, was a small cassette-style voice recorder and a single, labeled tape. The label just had my name on it. Clara. I thanked Father Michael, my throat too tight to say more. After he left, I sat for a long time, just staring at the tape. I was terrified to listen. What if it was just more pain? What if it was a confirmation of everything Mark had said? Finally, with a deep breath, I pressed play. And then I heard his voice. Not the weak, frail voice of his last days, but the stronger, warmer voice I remembered from years ago. It filled the small, lonely room, and for a moment, it felt like he was there with me. "Clara, my girl," it began. "If you are hearing this, then I am gone, and I fear the vultures have descended. I am sorry. Sorry for not being stronger, for not formalizing things in a way they couldn't break. They don't understand love like we did." Tears streamed down my face. He went on, talking about my mother, about how he'd promised her he would always look after me, a promise he considered sacred. And then he said the words that would change everything. "They see the house, the money. They don't see the real inheritance I'm leaving you, Clara. It's not in a bank. It's in your hands. Do you remember the old workshop in the basement? All those hours we spent down there when you were a little girl? You had the touch, even then. The patience. I taught you how to listen to the wood, how to feel its story. That is your legacy. It's a gift no one can take from you. He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice a balm on my wounded soul. He talked about joinery, about the properties of oak versus pine, about the art of bringing something broken and discarded back to life. It was a masterclass taught from beyond the grave. And in that tiny, peeling apartment, surrounded by darkness, a small, fragile spark ignited within me. He hadn't just left me a memory, he had left me a blueprint. He had left me a trade. He had left me a purpose. That tape became my Bible. I listened to it every single day, his voice guiding me, encouraging me. I used the last of my savings to rent a small, dusty storage unit that had a single power outlet and one dim, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. It wasn't the spacious, well-lit workshop from my childhood, but it was mine. I started by scavenging. I'd walk through the city on my days off from the diner, finding broken chairs left on the curb, wobbly tables in thrift stores, discarded dressers behind antique shops. I brought these broken, forgotten things back to my little cave and began the painstaking work of healing them. My first few attempts were disastrous. I made a mess of the finishes, my joints were clumsy, and I got more splinters than I could count. There were nights I'd sit on the cold concrete floor, crying in frustration, the smell of turpentine and my own failure thick in the air. But then I'd go home, play the tape, and hear his voice calm and steady, talking me through the process, reminding me to be patient, to respect the wood. So I'd go back the next day and try again. I sold my mother's last piece of jewelry, a simple gold locket, to buy a decent set of used chisels and a hand plane. I learned to work with my hands in a new way, not just to care but to create. I discovered a deep, meditative peace in the slow, rhythmic work. The scrape of the plane, the tap of the mallet, the smell of sawdust and wax. These became the sounds and smells of my new life. It was hard, exhausting work. I kept my job at the diner, working late into the night, and then I'd go to my storage unit and work until the sun came up, fueled by cheap coffee and a desperate, burning need to prove, if only to myself, that I was more than what my cousin had labeled me. My first real victory came about 6 months in. I had found an old, dilapidated rocking chair, its caning completely shredded, and one of its rockers split. It looked hopeless. But I spent weeks on it, carefully gluing the rocker, sanding the wood down to its original, beautiful grain, and teaching myself the intricate art of caning from old library books. I put it up for sale on a local online marketplace, not expecting much. A few days later, an elderly woman contacted me. She came to my storage unit, her eyes widening slightly at the Spartan conditions. She walked around the chair, her hand ghosting over the smooth, newly finished wood. It's just like the one my husband made for me when our first son was born, she said, her voice trembling. We lost it in a fire years ago. She told me her story, how her husband had passed away, and how seeing the chair was like seeing a piece of him again. When she sat in it, a small, sad smile touched her lips. I sold her the chair for a price that barely covered my materials, but the look on her face, the way she clutched my hand and thanked me with tears in her eyes, that was a payment beyond any currency. In that moment, I wasn't just fixing a broken chair, I was restoring a piece of someone's heart. I was giving a memory a new life. My purpose, which had been so brutally stolen from me, began to reform, stronger and more beautiful than before. Word began to spread. The elderly woman told her friends. Soon I was getting calls. An old sea chest that had been in a family for generations. A dining table scarred by years of life and love. Each piece came with a story, and I became the custodian of these stories, my workshop a sanctuary for broken things. I was finally able to quit the diner. I moved into a slightly bigger apartment, one with 2 windows. My reputation grew. People started referring to me not just as a repair person, but as a restorer, an artisan. The girl who had been told she was nothing was now building a name for herself, one splinter, one coat of varnish, one resurrected memory at a time. It was there, with my own 2 hands, covered in sawdust and stain, that I began to rewrite my story. I stopped being the victim and became the author of my own destiny. If my journey of overcoming is inspiring you, subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapters and become part of this community of new beginnings. Life found a new rhythm, a steady, satisfying cadence of work and quiet contentment. My little business, which I named the Second Chance Workshop, was thriving. I had a waiting list of clients and had even hired a young apprentice to help me. The workshop had moved out of the storage unit and into a proper storefront with large windows where I could display my finished pieces. I was happy. Not in the way I had been before in that sheltered, dependent world, but in a deeper, more resilient way. It was a happiness I had built myself, from the ground up. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, the bell above my shop door chimed, and in walked the ghost I thought I had buried. It was Mark. He looked different, thinner, with a new tension around his eyes, but he still wore the same expensive suit, which now seemed to hang off him slightly. He looked around the workshop, a flicker of disbelief, maybe even grudging respect, in his eyes. He didn't apologize. He didn't even acknowledge the past. He acted as if he were any other customer. He told me he had acquired a piece, a very valuable 18th century secretary desk, but it had been damaged in transport. He had heard, he said with a tight smile, that I was the best. He wanted me to restore it. The old Clara would have shrunk. She would have felt a rush of fear, of anger, of that same crushing inadequacy he had instilled in her at the funeral. But I was not the old Clara. I was a woman who knew the strength in her own hands, a woman who knew the value of her own work. I walked over to him, wiping my hands on my canvas apron. I didn't offer him a seat. I listened calmly as he described the damage, my mind already assessing the work, the materials needed, the time it would take. I was a professional. This was a job. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly. "So, can you fix it?" he asked, a hint of his old arrogance returning. "Yes, I can," I said, my voice even and calm. I walked over to my own desk, a beautiful old oak piece I had resurrected from a pile of junk, and pulled out a consultation form. My consultation fee is $200 to be paid up front. That will cover a full assessment of the piece and a detailed quote for the restoration. My current lead time is 6 months. If that is acceptable, I will require a 50% deposit before any work begins. I said it all without a trace of emotion, looking him directly in the eye. I saw a flash of surprise, then irritation. He was used to being in control, to setting the terms. Here, in my world, the world I had built, he had no power. He was just a client. He hesitated, clearly wrestling with his pride. But he knew, from the reputation I'd built, that he wouldn't find anyone better. He pulled a wallet from his jacket, the expensive leather looking out of place among the sawdust and tools, and laid 2 crisp $100 bills on my desk. "Fine," he clipped. "Let me know what it will cost." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded, wrote him a receipt, and told him my apprentice would help him unload the desk in the back. That was our confrontation. There was no shouting, no dramatic rehashing of his betrayal. The victory was in the quiet dignity of the transaction. The victory was in him having to come to me, to recognize my skill, to pay for my time. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. My respect for myself. He paid the deposit, and 6 months later, he paid the final, very substantial bill. We never spoke of that day in the church. We never had to. Today, my life is full. My workshop is not just my business. It is my sanctuary. It is a place where broken things are made whole again. Every piece of furniture I work on carries a history, and I feel a profound connection to the lives they have touched. My legacy isn't in a house or a bank account. It's in the restored beauty of a forgotten heirloom, in the joy of a client seeing a piece of their past brought back to life, and in the quiet strength I found within myself. I never needed his name or his blood to have worth. My worth was in my hands, in my heart, all along. The man who raised me taught me that, not with legal papers, but with lessons in patience, in respect for the craft, and in the enduring power of love. That was my true inheritance. Today, I understand that the wounds of the past do not define who we are, but what we do with them does. I am immensely grateful that you have listened to my story this far. If it has touched you, share it with someone who needs a light, and leave a comment with a word of strength and hope. Together, we are stronger.